Welcome, brave souls, to another journey into the darkness. Prepare yourselves for a tale that will send shivers down your spine and haunt your dreams forever. I have prepared my most macabre terror story that I can think of that matches a real horror movie to share with you, so brace yourselves, for this story will make your blood run cold and your heart race with dread. The movie I will be talking about is Real Case of Shadow People, the Sarah McCormick Story.
This afternoon.
Right now, we're tracking new developments in the search for 3 missing people. And earlier today, investigators located a car connected to this case.
We're tracking the search this afternoon for 3 people who are
now,
missing.
These are people who just vanished.
Real Case of Shadow People, the Sarah McCormick Story, is a found footage horror film that was released in 2019, directed by Joseph Mazzaferro. It presents itself as a documentary-style investigation into a mysterious case involving paranormal phenomenon, specifically encounters with shadow people. These are believed to be dark, shadowy entities that appear to people, often accompanied by feelings of fear, dread, or malice. The plot overview. The film centers around 3 college students, Sarah McCormick, Joseph Mazzaferro, and Nick Kunti, who decide to investigate the urban legend of shadow people for a school project. Shadow people are commonly believed to be malvoyant supernatural entities that appear in the peripheral of vision, often during times of extreme stress or just before someone experiences sleep paralysis. While initially skeptical, the group becomes more deeply involved in the investigation as strange and terrifying occurrences begin to happen to them. The investigation and disappearance. The documentary-style footage starts with Sarah and her friends visiting various locations said to be haunted by shadow people. They also interview witnesses who claim to have seen these entities, gathering more information about what these beings might be and why they appear. As their research intensifies, the group starts experiencing unusual phenomena themselves. Strange noises, fleeting glimpses of figures in the dark, and feelings of being watched. Their encounters become more frequent and aggressive, especially with Sarah, who appears to be the most affected by the entities. The supernatural occurrences escalate, and it becomes apparent that these shadow people are not just a myth, but something far more sinister and dangerous. Eventually, the students go missing. The footage that makes up the film is reportedly what was recovered after their disappearance. As the film progresses, it becomes clear that Sarah, in particular, was the focal point of the entity's attention, and she becomes consumed by their presence. Her fate is left ambiguous, but the implication is that the shadow people were responsible for her and her friend's disappearance. The found footage style and themes. The film used the found footage style to give it a sense of realism, Much like other films in the genre, such as The Blair Witch Project or Paranormal Activity, the horror lies not in special effects or over-graphic scenes, but in the subtle creeping dread that builds throughout the film as the group is drawn further into the shadow people phenomenon. The reception. The film received mixed reviews. Some viewers appreciated its slow burn, atmospheric tension, and commitment to its documentary style presentation. Others felt that it lended too heavily on the found footage formula without offering anything new or particularly frightening. Its low budget nature and pacing were points of critique, but for fans of paranormal or documentary style horror, it can be an intriguing watch. The story of the Sarah McCormick story plays on common fears of the unknown, tapping into urban legends about shadowy entities that exist at the edge of perception. The ambiguity of what happens to the characters and the eerie sense of realism make it a compelling, albeit niche, horror experience. And now, here are 4 short stories of real cases of shadow people. The case of the night visitor. One of the most widely reported real-life cases of shadow people comes from a woman named Alice who lived in a quiet suburb in the 1990s. Alice had never been particularly interested in the paranormal, but one night she experienced something that changed her perspective forever. It was a quiet, uneventful evening, and Alice had just gone to bed. As she lay there in the dark, she felt an overwhelming sense of unease, as though she was being watched. Slowly, her eyes adjusted to the darkness, and in the corner of her bedroom, she noticed a tall, dark figure. At first, she assumed it was a trick of the light or her imagination, but then the figure moved. The figure was human-shaped, but had no distinct features. It was a solid black silhouette, darker than the room around it, and seemed to absorb the light. The figure stood there for what felt like hours, motionless, watching her. Alice was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or speak. Finally, she mustered the strength to reach for the bedside lamp, but the second her hand touched it, the shadow person disappeared into thin air. Shaken, Alice tried to rationalize the experience, but the following night, the shadow person returned. This time, it was closer to her bed. Again, it watched her, and again, she was unable to move or scream. For weeks, this continued, the figure coming closer and closer each night. Alice grew more and more terrified, sleeping with the lights on and even seeking help from a local priest. Finally, one night, the figure approached so close that it reached out towards her. In panic, Alice screamed and threw the covers over her head. When she dared to peek out, the figure was gone, and she never saw it again. But the experience left her deeply traumatized. She moved to a new house shortly afterwards, hoping to leave the terror behind, but she never forgot the fear of those nights. Story 2. The Haunting of Heidi Warwick. One of the most well-documented cases involving shadow people happened to a young girl named Heidi Warwick in Georgia, USA. Her story began in the early 1980s when she was just a child. Heidi started seeing what she described as people who weren't really people. She told her parents about these encounters, describing one of the figures as an elderly man in a white shirt, who she refers to as Mr. Gordy. At first, her parents thought it was simply an imaginary friend. However, things took a sinister turn when Heidi started seeing dark, faceless figures in the house. Heidi described these new entities as shadow people, black human-shaped figures that would lurk around her house and follow her into her room. Unlike Mr. Gordy, these figures felt malvoyant and would often approach her in the middle of the night. Heidi's family became concerned when they started experiencing strange phenomena too, like objects moving on their own and cold spots throughout the house. Eventually, paranormal investigators were called in, and their findings were chilling. The investigators believed that the Warwick house was built on land with a violent history, possibly explaining the strange activities. They also concluded that Heidi's ability to see both the benevolent Mr. Gordy and the shadow people indicates she was sensitive to paranormal energies. Despite the investigation, the hauntings continued for years. Heidi's case attracted national attention and was even featured in television shows, including Unsolved Mysteries. As Heidi grew older, the shadow people sightings lessened but never entirely disappeared. Story 3: The Sleep Paralysis Visitor. A man named Tom, living in London, experienced a terrifying encounter with a shadow person during an episode of sleep paralysis in 2015. Tom had never experienced sleep paralysis before, but one night he woke up in the middle of the night, completely unable to move. As he lay there frozen, he felt a weight on his chest, making it hard to breathe. Panic beginning to set in, but the worst was yet to come. Out of the corner of his eye, Tom noticed a figure standing in the doorway of his bedroom. It was a tall, shadowy figure with no face or distinguishing features, but it retaliated a sense of malice. Slowly, the figure began to move towards him, gliding rather than walking. As it reached his bedside, it leaned over him, staring down at his helpless form. Tom's heart raced, and he struggled to scream, but no sound came out. The figure loomed over him for what felt like an eternity. Finally, just as Tom thought he couldn't take it anymore, the shadow person dissolved into the darkness, and he regained control of his body, shaken and drenched in sweat. He leaped out of bed, certain that what he had seen was not a hallucination. Throughout, Tom researched sleep paralysis and learned that the phenomenon could explain his encounter. This visceral fear he felt convinced him that what he saw was something real, something beyond sleep disorders and scientific explanations. He never experienced anything like it again, but remains haunted by the memory of the shadowy figure that invaded his room that night. Story 4: The Hat Man Phenomenon. One of the more specific types of shadow people encountered by many individuals is known as the Hat Man. This particular figure is often described as a tall, shadowy figure wearing a wide-brim hat, and he is said to appear in various locations around the world. In one well-known case, a man named Jack from New York City recounted his encounter with the Hat Man in the early 2000s. Jack had been having recurring nightmares about being chased by a tall, shadowy figure with a hat. One night, he awoke from one of these nightmares to find the very same figure standing at the edge of his bed. Unlike other shadow people who seem to disappear when confronted, the Hat Man stood still, watching Jack for several minutes. Jack described the Hat Man as having a vaguely human shape, but no visible face or features. He retaliated an intense sense of dread. After what felt like an eternity, the Hat Man turned and slowly walked out of Jack's bedroom, dissolving into the wall as he left. Jack's story isn't unique. The Hat Man has been reported by people all over the world, leading some researchers to believe that this particular shadow figure might be a specific entity, separate from other shadow people. Despite extensive research and numerous eyewitnesses' accounts, the mystery of the Hat Man remains unsolved. These stories of shadow people represent just a few of the countless reports from around the world. Those skeptics argue that sleep disorders, psychological phenomenon, or tricks of the light could explain these encounters. Those who have experienced shadow people often remain convinced that they are dealing with something much more sinister and unexplainable. Thank you for tuning in to these eerie tales. Until next time, stay tuned for more spine-chilling stories. This was Sandra Pink.